Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice. I'm Dennis Stone, Director of the Center, and this evening we have a town hall discussing latest developments and ideas regarding community policing, beyond policing, looking at what possibilities are for the immediate and long-term in terms of improving our situation in Jacksonville relative to crime and public safety. And this is part of the Jacksonville Urban League's Stop the Violence, Make Peace campaign. And we're very grateful to our speakers this evening, Tammy Hodo, Randy Nelson, and Bishop Mark McGuire. The doctors Hodo and Nelson have worked locally on a number of issues, and Bishop McGuire has begun to do that as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniela Rodriguez, who is moderating our panel, and will also introduce Sasha Wilson, who will be presenting on issues. Both Daniela and Sasha are Urban League interns at the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice. I want to also recognize Jamie Krasnigor, another intern who is with us this evening. So with that, I'll turn it over to Daniela.
Thank you, Dennis. And I do apologize if you hear barking in the background. That's my dog. But as Dennis said, we are going to be concentrating on building community relations as a part for our Stop the Violence, Make Peace campaign. Joining us today are three speakers. We have Dr. Randy Nelson. He is the director of the Center for Law and Social Justice at Bethune-Cookman University. We also have Bishop Mark McGuire. He is the founder, executive director, and CEO of CARE's Justice Institute Incorporated. And we also have Dr. Tammy Hodo. She is the founder and CEO of All Things Diverse LLC. So we would like to thank these speakers for taking the time out of their day, joining us and enlightening us with your knowledge and experience. But before we begin, we do have Sasha Wilson, a fellow intern, who did prepare a PowerPoint presentation just to provide a little bit more context onto what police community relations is, what it constitutes of, what issues affect those relationships, and what we can do to kind of solve them. So with that, I will pass it over to Sasha.
Hi, everyone. Give me a second to share my screen. Can everyone hear me better?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Share. Okay, so this presentation is on looking beyond policing. And to look beyond policing means to what measures can you use as an alternative, as opposed to using your weapon or having to use a taser. What can be done or what can be avoided if we just simply communicate with one another as police officer to the community. You're here to protect me, and as a community member, I should be here to make your job better. So I'm gonna go ahead and get into it. So we're gonna go over beyond policing and understanding the different police communal tensions. And then after this, we'll have, insight from our guest speakers who work actively in this field. Okay, so what's going on is, as of late and more recently, there have been increased tensions between the community and police officers all over the nation. The different acts of what has been recognized as police brutality cause a lack of mistrust of the police in doing their job. As a result, the community and law enforcement community have become estranged from one another even more. And this is important because when emergencies happen, you call the police. When you need assistance with anything, you call the police. On campuses, you have community service officers. So if you can't trust the people who are there to protect you, then we have a big problem, because in times of need, then people are going to take matters into their own hands. And that's something we also want to avoid. So why we need to look beyond policing, and this is why it's important: perception. The perception of the police is linked with communal trust of the government. The police are the most visible representation of the government. It's not likely that you'll walk into a Publix or a Walmart and you'll see a governor or a mayor that you'll be able to speak to. So our first form of contact of what's being done, what's being enforced, the reflection of legislation comes with the police officers. Perspective. Young African-American men specifically do not feel comfortable participating in public meetings out of fear of not being taken seriously due to their unfamiliarity with policy language, and not because they don't want to be involved, but because they don't understand. So we have to look at it in a sense, well, maybe these people aren't coming to town hall meetings because they don't understand, or they don't feel like they'll be heard. So I feel like we need to do more on both ends with educating and showing that it's okay to ask questions. We also need to make more safe spaces where we can just go to people and, you know, their professions and ask them, hey, I don't understand what you meant by this. Can you explain further? So that there's no miscommunications and that we can further, you know, expand our knowledges as police officers, teachers, guidance counselors, and people to work with one another. And the amount of force. Research has also demonstrated that living in a neighborhood with high levels of aggressive policing, it reduces the likelihood of civilians calling for help. So again, as I've mentioned earlier, instead of calling for help, you feel the need to take matters into your own hands. This is, say, for example, a robbery. Someone's coming to someone else's house and you have a weapon of your own, you want to use it. And then it becomes like someone accidentally getting shot, like little kids, or any other accidents may occur. So we have to keep in mind that even with the police themselves, when they're coming to de-escalate a situation, weapons don't need to be used all the time. So the amount of force, whether it's people on people or police on people, we have to minimize the force that we're using and change our approach of how we go into these situations of conflict. Important statistics. These I found very interesting as I was doing my research with the different articles that were published. Police is the leading cause of death of Black men, who are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement than a white man. There are 137 police oversight entities for the city and county police departments, covering 124 jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions have more than one oversight body, which means 1% of local police departments are subject to community oversight. Community oversight just means that they have people patrolling and looking out to see what's going on. Kind of like no weapons, just talking to people. So 1% out of a nation that has hundreds and millions of people, that's not really enough people without their weapon that look approachable to speak to as a police officer. So we need more friendly community oversight officers walking around and, you know, engaging with the community. Over here, sorry, I can't see the top of my screen. Sorry. Police officers report that it's not unusual for law enforcement officials to turn a blind eye to improper conduct of other officers. It's more so mostly rookies. They're afraid of their superiors, which we should change. As a police officer working with other officers, you should feel comfortable to go to them and ask them for advice on the job. I feel like that culture should be changed because their job is, you know, to protect and serve, not to cover up any instances. Because when justice needs to be brought to light, I feel like on both ends, we have a responsibility to do the right thing at all times. 135 police officers were killed in the line of duty in 2016, which was the highest number of fatalities in the past 5 years prior to that. So between 2011 and 2016, that many officers were killed. But annually, 1,149 officers to 1,300 citizens lose their lives annually as a result of excessive force and brutality. Here's what we need: transparency, presentations of effectively communicating the role of each party, joint accountability, presentations of each party owning their role in the tensions, mutual support, presentations of each party understanding and supporting one another for the sake of the community, and trust, presentations of each party believing in each other to do their part the proper way. This is a TED Talk that I will share the link to in the chat. It's from a police officer herself who in her department, they began practicing community policing. And she explains the meaning and the history behind the uniform to give more insight as to why some people have a reluctance of trusting the police officer. And she also showed and shared statistics of how community policing changed the rate of crime in their neighborhood. For example, one example she mentioned in the video that gave me, a different perspective of this is that instead of passing out speeding tickets in neighborhoods where there are a lot of children or a lot of car accidents, they put a petition together to, place more speed bumps, which slows down the amount of speeding in the neighborhoods. So kind of going around the problem and looking for another way to solve it, as opposed to directly kind of like putting fear or causing unnecessary fear between you and the person you're stopping. Because when you look at the news, someone else is getting shot by a police officer. So it kind of makes you apprehensive to comply, and you kind of go in self-defense mode when there's other reasons, or not other reasons, but other ways to, speak with one another. Here, this is also different suggestions of what we can do. We can create more safe spaces. We can also increase positive interactions, and we can, implement what was put in the video, the effective community policing program. This looks differently in every city depending on the relationship between the police and the community. So how it's done in Jacksonville versus how it's done in Tampa may be different. So I feel like the leaders in those communities should come together and kind of figure out what works for them. But there should also be some type of uniform, structure in order to get this done. And we should also implement more community service for both the officer and community members. If you're around each other and you see each other more as people, there's no intimidation behind the uniform. That's just Ron from down the street who's a police officer and he's my friend, and not just someone who, has a weapon and I don't. So I feel like these are things that we can implement in all communities and kind of go in the right direction. And now it's just open forum for if you have your insights for what we can do as the community and what we feel like the police should do. And if there's also anyone, in your professions, you can give insight as well. But these are the options through my research that I was able to find that I wanted to share, because I feel like going beyond policing would benefit all communities in a lot of ways. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Sasha. I really enjoyed the presentation, and now I'm happy to open the floor if anybody has some insight they want to share or any questions they want to ask. Also, you feel free to leave the questions in the chat box if you're hesitant to speak. No issues with that. But just to keep things going, I am more than happy to introduce our first speaker of the night. We have Dr. Randy Nelson. He currently serves as the program director for the Bethune-Cookman University Criminal Justice Administration graduate program. Dr. Nelson earned a BA in the University of, Dr. Nelson earned a BA in sociology from Eckerd College, an MA in criminology from the University of South Florida, and a PhD in criminology from Florida State University. Throughout his academic and professional career, Dr. Nelson focused on developing and evaluating delinquency prevention strategies designed to address the problems that negatively impact disadvantaged communities, primarily communities of color. Dr. Nelson has an extensive history of working with nonprofit, faith, and community-based organizations to develop and effectively achieve their goals. Through his work, he has influenced various evaluation projects throughout the state of Florida. Dr. Nelson has secured more than $6 million in state, federal, and private funding to address racial disparities within Florida's criminal justice, juvenile justice, education, dependency, and health systems. As a nationally recognized law enforcement consultant for community policing and engagement strategies, he has authored more than 50 technical reports, research publications, and presented his findings at multiple state and national conferences, highlighting the effective strategies that we can use to engage communities of color. So, hi, Dr. Nelson, how are you doing tonight?
Good, how are you? Glad to be here.
Doing well, doing well.
Good. Well, thanks for the invite, and I think this is a needed and value-added conversation. And I'll be brief in my comments, and I'll speak more generally, and Bishop McGuire will speak specifically to the work that we're doing in Jacksonville. But if one sentence could sum up what it is that I would like to get across is that policing isn't something you do to a community, it's something you do with a community. And that is where we start. Whether you're Black, white, green or yellow, Jew or Gentile, rich or poor, Democrat, Republican or independent, we all deserve a safe and nurturing environment to raise our family. And that's where we always start with our work, with our workshops, with our training, whether we're training law enforcement or doing workshops in the community. We start with, we all deserve that, no less. And that is the work. So for the past 15 or 20 years, we've been working from Bakersfield, California to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, working with law enforcement and communities to strengthen the relationship between law enforcement and the community, as well as make communities safer. And I think by strengthening that relationship between law enforcement and community, it makes communities safer. Now, how do we do that? First, we go in and we train law enforcement leadership. Those that are the sheriffs, the police chief, the command staff that within the law enforcement agency. And that training is more geared toward how do they support and lead law enforcement professionals that are going in serving communities. What does that look like? It's more than giving someone a gun and a badge and going and saying serve. There has to be leadership, and that leadership has to consist of having awareness of why it is that some communities, particularly communities of color, may look at law enforcement with a jaundiced eye, because policing, the badge means different things to different people because of the history of it. And folks talk about not wanting to discuss or have conversations about the history, but it's relevant that policing, the foundation of policing, started with slave patrols. That's a relevant conversation that we must have. Not that every police officer that served today is a slave patrol, but that history is important because that history is passed along, and for them not to know, how can you, once again, you can't serve a people unless you know a people. So it's part of that conversation. We train the leadership, then we go and train law enforcement. We start with law enforcement. Those that have decided that they wanted to have a career to serve and protect. That means that they have to give up the safety of their homes, their environment, and go out and serve and protect. And that includes being willing to sacrifice your life for folk that don't look like you, folk that don't know you, and folk that may not even like you. But you have to be willing to put everything on the line for them. And it takes a noble human being to do that work. That's something that's not in me and my DNA to do. I was a parole officer years ago, and I did it about 4 years. And I think that anybody that can run into a building when people are shooting inside and run in while others are running out, there's a special place in heaven for somebody that's willing to do that work. And that work will always be needed. And it should come with a level of respect. Now, law enforcement should be held to a higher standard. Anytime I do a training, wherever I do a training, that's the first question I ask. Do you, and these are law enforcement professionals, do you think that law enforcement should be held to a higher standard? I've yet to go into a room where folk then raise their hands saying, yes, they should be. And what I say is, if you didn't raise your hand, you need to exit the room and come back, because anyone that has the authority to take life and liberty under the guise of the law should be held to a higher standard. I mean, if you don't believe that, that's not a profession or job for you. Now, that standard can't be the Jesus Christ standard, that you can walk on water and you're a perfect human being. That can't be the standard. But damn well, there should be a higher standard for law enforcement professionals, because they have power and authority that the President of the United States doesn't have. The President of the United States can't go and arrest and take someone's life or liberty under the law. He can't, but law enforcement professionals can, and that requires a higher level of not only responsibility, but accountability. And that's part of the conversation with law enforcement professionals, that recognizing that even in this climate where folk look at law enforcement or jaundiced eye because of George Floyd, because of Breonna Taylor. And those things didn't happen in Jacksonville, but folk in Jacksonville see, feel, and that also shapes their perception of law enforcement. So law enforcement have to be aware of that. I don't think that you have to own everything that a law enforcement professional in other places do. But what you do have to own is a responsibility for making sure that your actions, your activity, your engagement are such that the people in Jacksonville know and are assured that when they call the police, they know what they're getting. And I think that's part of our work. So after we train the leadership, we train law enforcement. And once again, law enforcement, it's a matter of how do you engage a community that's suspicious and fearful or mistrustful of you. So you have young men and women that are coming into the profession saying, I want to protect and serve, and this is what I want to do. And I think that they should be, respected for making that decision. And then they go into a community and folk are looking at them, or something happened, someone shot broad daylight, they go out there and, well, no one saw anything unless it's my child. If it's my child, I'll tell on everybody. If it's someone else's child, I'm not getting involved. That does impact the psyche of a law enforcement professional. If I'm willing to leave my home, sacrifice life, health, and all to go and serve, and we're trying to see who murdered or shot someone, and then the community is like, indifferent about it, that also, I think, is a part of the conversation. For me, accountability goes both ways. It's not just accountability for law enforcement. I don't think a Black life only matters when law enforcement take it. And the fact of the matter, one of the statistics that Sasha provided earlier, and that's another thing, I think we should have context in a forum and a platform to discuss those. It was saying that police violence is the leading cause of Black males' death. We may need to go back and revisit that, or add context to it, because I'm not getting the context of that. But I do believe that these are forms where we should be able to have those conversations. And it's true that Black males are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police violence. That's true. It is also true that my son is more likely to be killed by someone that looks like him than the police. So both of those things are true, and both of those things must be addressed. And that's where I think the conversation isn't this or that, it's this and that. We still have to have those difficult conversations, both internally as a community, but also with law enforcement. Now, the third part, after we train law enforcement leadership, we train the law enforcement officers, then we go into the community. And we have training with the community, and that involves the community being open and honest about how they feel about law enforcement, why they feel it. Some of them feel that way because of things that they've seen on television, nothing that they've experienced themselves. Some of it is things that they've heard, and some of it is things that they've experienced themselves. So having those conversations about just that, and what it is that they expect in terms of the safety of their community. Because I was in Orlando, Florida, a 3-year-old and a 14-year-old were shot down in their community. I fly off to Little Rock, Arkansas. The day I arrived, a 4-year-old and a 19-year-old shot down in our community. Those things happen across this country, and they still, 3 of those cases haven't been solved. So the conversation is, how do we improve the safety and well-being of our community? Some of it is us looking in the mirror saying, we have to do it. It can't be that we're willing to knock down the walls of China if someone else does it, but when it's in our community, we either turn a blind eye or don't want to talk about it. That to me is just as destructive. Now, by the same token, I think George Floyd in that incident shed light on things that the Black community, the trauma that they've suffered for years. And you had some white folk that just didn't believe law enforcement had done, they would give them the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes that's deserved. And George Floyd, what it showed is that you had someone callous enough to that didn't have any regard for human life take a man's life on national television and didn't care one iota. That not only shook white Americans, but that shook folk across the world. And because it's one thing to hear folks say that police doesn't treat us the same way. Is another one to visually see it on national, play out on national television. And that conversation, I think, has sparked a lot of conversation. Now, the only thing I don't want from that conversation is every law enforcement professional is bad. That can't be the conversation. Then it's very difficult to get talented young men and women of color to want to go into a profession that not only they believe or community believe that Derek Chauvin is all of law enforcement. And nor would I like police to believe that every young Black male in inner city are thugs. So once again, is that this and that conversation, not this or that conversation. So once we train in the community, we train both faith leaders, stakeholders, and youth. We actually have a separate conversation with youth. We're working with Ed White High School now with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, where we're pairing up law enforcement professionals with, we've had our third group cohort, I think it's 10 to 12 young men that come for 4 weeks, and they're partnered with a law enforcement professional, and they get together as a community service team. It's not a mentoring project, it's community service team. Though each team of 2, they join together and do projects in their community, in the communities that those young men live in. That may even range from the young man and the officer going to church together. We've had officers that get some of the young men are athletes, so they'll get their jersey name and number and go to their game. One of the things that really touched me with that was we've done that several times, and usually every time the young men, none of them ever had a non-enforcement relationship with law enforcement like they do now. So they sat in a room, had conversation. They had never done that before. It's always have been from a distance. So it's difficult to hate up close. It's difficult for anyone to hate up close. And that's part of that conversation, is bringing them together and letting them, we don't put any parameters, you have to mentor, you have to do this, let them human beings engage. And I think young Black males seeing that and experiencing that is different than what they see or accustomed to in the streets or in other places. So I think that part is excellent. Now, after we do the leadership, we do the law enforcement, we do the community, we do the youth, we bring all of them together. Because once you share everybody's perspective, law enforcement, this is how the community feel and why. Community, this is how law enforcement feel and why. It's one conversation when you're going in and you're feeling that the way you see the world is the way the world is. It's another when you can see the world from your vantage point and your view, but you also recognize that others have different views and vantage points. Not deficient, not defective, but different. And when you bring everybody in, when we're all at least having awareness of, we don't have to say that we know, we understand others' perspective or views, but having awareness of, and particularly in law enforcement, I liken it to if you only watch Fox News, if you only watch CNN, if you only watch MSNBC. Private citizens can do that, but law enforcement professionals, public servants, they have to be able to watch it all. Not that they have to agree with all of it, but in order to serve our people, you have to know our people. And with law enforcement, you don't pick and choose which calls you can go on. You can't go on a call that is just white folk, just Muslims, just Catholic, just Republican, just Democrat. You have to go in and serve all people. And part of that serving all people is being able to look through their lens and being able to say that although I'm a Black male, I can go serve a middle-class white community. Although I'm a white female, I can go serve West Side Jackson. All of those conversations are and have to be a part of developing the next generation of law enforcement professionals. So that's why I'm glad I see a lot of the young men and women from Edward Waters College University now on this call. And we at Bethune-Cookman University is the same way. we're not trying to develop the next police officer or sheriff or deputy sheriff. We're trying to develop the next chief, the next sheriff, the next leader. We're not trying to produce a police officer. We want folk that are strong enough and committed enough to go in and change law enforcement to what it should be and how it should be and how it should continue to evolve from the inside, not on the outside talking about it, but on the inside working it. So this is a whole lot of conversation, but the gist of everything is that, once again, policing isn't something you do to a community, it's something you do with. And that with means that the community has a responsibility and an obligation as well. And how do we work together to that common end of a safe place for everybody to live and raise a family? So that's where we are. And as I said before, Bishop McGuire will talk more specifically about these items that I did in generalities, how we're implementing them in Orlando, in Jacksonville now. And once again, we're doing the same work in Orlando and St. Petersburg and Daytona. So it's around the state of Florida, but it is the work. And the beauty of it is that we go in and we do the work, we do an action plan, but then we leave. The community have to take ownership in terms of holding themselves and law enforcement accountable for making sure that the strategies and the action plans that they put together in collaboration with law enforcement are implemented, because other than that, it's just an action plan and no action. So I'll leave it there. If there are any questions, we can do that, or we can do them at the end. So I don't know how we're going to do this, Dennis.
So yeah, we could definitely open the floor. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Nelson? Or if you're more comfortable, you can leave them in the chat and we can address them later on. Yes, DDJ operations.
Yes, I'm sorry, DJJ operations. I'm Patricia Mom with the Department of Juvenile Justice. Thank you, Mr. Nelson, for your very insightful, by the way. I appreciate this forum and talking about our youth and our community and the families. And the question I had is, when you're looking at how we bring the community into discussions of law enforcement, are we also taking into account, for example, what I find as I work with the Department of Juvenile Justice is that there's so much focus on either one area of the community and not enough focus on another. So for example, our kids that are on probation, our kids that are been to residential programs, or for lack of a better word, kiddie prisons, nobody really wants to work with them. So I hear the collaboration and the talk about, connecting with law enforcement. But I think one of the issues is that if you're not talking to those kids who are already involved in the system, how do you allow them to influence the ones that are not involved? Because there's a lot of focus, again, on we're going to talk to this group, the ones that are in, football teams, the ones that are not involved in the system, but the ones that are in the system at times, they also need that exposure. So are we taking into account when we're exposing kids, is it also everyone and not just cherry picking the easiest population to work with? Because from my observation, that's kind of what it looks like, is that we cherry pick what's the easiest group of kids or people to work with. And I think that's one of the concerns, is that we don't really want to have the honest conversations. So that's just kind of.
No.
Oh, Dr. Nelson, you muted yourself.
I think you're absolutely right. I think when we talk about a community conversation, it's all the community. And with Edward White High School, the principal selects, and she doesn't. Matter of fact, some of the young men are DJJ young men. So that's excellent, but that's not always the case. But they have to be a part of that conversation, because I think when you talk about community safety, they're a part of that conversation one way or the other. So they definitely have to be a part of that conversation. And years ago, when I had a contract with the Department of Juvenile Justice, I visited all 26 juvenile detention centers, and the conversation was not only about them getting their lives back on track and dusting themselves up and going back out. But the impact that their actions have not only on their families, but on the communities. So some of that, you can either be a part of the problem and part of the solution. And you being here in these locked confinement, you know this is the life that you want to live. How and what must you do to do better on the other side? And more importantly, how can we help you? So all of that is a part of the conversation. So I agree. All hands on deck.
Thank you.
Alrighty, with that, we'll segue into our second speaker. So we have Bishop Mark McGuire. He is a native Daytonian, and he is the founder, executive director, and CEO of Cares Justice Institute Incorporated. Also, he serves as the founder, board of directors, president, and bishop of the Potter's House Dayton International Ministries, and as a staff pastor and youth director of discipleship, outreach, and evangelism of the Potter's House International Ministries of Jacksonville, Florida. He's also the executive director for Cure Violence Jacksonville Westside MVB team through the Potter's House Community Development Empowering Center Incorporated, a violence intervention and prevention program with the goal of teaching and modeling communicative ways to resolve conflicts peaceably among high-risk individuals. Bishop McGuire earned dual doctorates in philosophy of religion and theological studies from First Bible College of Daytona Beach, Florida. Oh, excuse me. I'm so sorry. I misread that. Bishop McGuire earned dual doctorates in philosophy of religion and theological studies from the First Bible College of Daytona Beach. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, anyway, continuing. He earned both a bachelor's of religious arts and biblical studies from Logos Christian College and a bachelor's of religious arts and applied theology from Logos University, both in Jacksonville, Florida. He serves as the coordinator for the collaboration of Bethune-Cookman University Center for Law and Social Justice and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office of the Community Safety and Engagement Plan. So, hi, Bishop McGuire, how are you doing this evening?
Fantastic. How are you? And welcome to everyone. I'm excited to be here. Danielle, you just want me to just kind of talk about the nuts and bolts of the action plan and moving forward with the things that Dr. Nelson alluded to for the specifics. Would that be good? Yeah. Okay, so I mean, one of the things that I think all of us are going to concur with as it relates to relationships with civilian community and law enforcement in order to build that bridge. And I know Dr. Tammy is probably going to allude to a lot of this, but when you're talking about that, you have to talk about non-enforcement interaction, where community and civilian community and law enforcement community begin to build real relationships that are built around trust and accountability, relationships that are built around empathy and empowerment, and an intentional infrastructure that is structured and synergistic. And so that both the civilian community and law enforcement community have to be active consistently in order for us to see a manifestation of new relationships, building relationships, trust, and mutual accountability. And so, you know, with the action plans, we had a great opportunity to get perspective from both sides. And I think that was powerful because there are so many civilian citizens who are not just aware of some of the danger of policing. And then there are those who are policing who are becoming numb to the perspective of community. And sometimes I think we have lost view of both the historical and systemic issues that have surrounded policing and community. And we cannot eliminate this word that sometimes is the elephant in the room, but racism plays a major role in many of these conversations and situations where we see both inequity and inequality. We see police brutality. We see unfair hiring practices. We see policy change that's needed. And a lot of times it's just a matter of addressing those things first. We talk about illicit bias. We talk about microaggression, all of these things that need to be addressed when we're talking about building relationship and making sure that there's what many are calling CQ or cultural intelligence, not only sensitivity, but competency, where we understand the differences of ethos. And we understand that there's not only ethnicity differences or diversities, but just cultural diversities within ethnicities. And so we just have to dwell a little bit deeper than we've been doing and not just move on the surface to just say that there's something that's being implemented, but we've got to move with a greater level of structure and synergy. So I'm excited about the Safety and Engagement Action Plan because it gave us some things that we can matrix. It gave us some things that we can begin to gauge, and we can have outcome measures, and we can look at consistency and productivity and moving forward in several areas. When we talk about the 21st century policing, we're talking about 6 pillars, but we, with this collaborative and the leadership of Dr. Nelson and being assisted by Dr. Youssef and others, there are 4 pillars that we kind of concentrated on. And in those 4 pillars, there were action items that we believe are going to help produce some of the synergy that's going to be necessary for us to see the improvement of relationships. First and foremost was building trust and legitimacy. And we talked about that a little bit already, where we've got non-enforcement encounters that have to take place. Along with that, we've got to look at opportunities or exposure to opportunities. It's been a long time since you've heard a room full of minority children talk about becoming a police officer, talking about becoming a part of law enforcement, because there has been this great gulf that has been created between minority citizens and law enforcement, where it's no longer, and excuse my term, a sexy occupation. It is almost demonic to a community. It's almost creating yourself as an adversary to those that with whom you live. And it's no longer popular, and it is frowned upon in many cases because of, you know, whatever we look at it as historical issues, if we look at as post-slavery syndromes, if we look at it as just issues between the races, whatever way we want to simplify it or make it complex, the bottom line is that we've run into an issue where we're not seeing this trust and legitimacy amongst law enforcement. We also talked about recruitment and how important targeted recruitment is when we're talking about building trust and legitimacy, making sure that this opportunity is put in front of all people and all walks of life, and making sure that individuals understand that it's not about running around with a billy club, a gun, or a taser, and hurting people and arresting people, but it's about safety and building a safe community and making sure those individuals that want to live as viable citizens in that community have an opportunity to do that. We also talked about police misconduct. There has to be a level of accountability. Dr. Nelson alluded to it, and I believe even Ms. Sasha mentioned, you know, when we talk about the George Floyd deal, the officers that stood around and allowed it to take place. There has to be some accountability from the inside. There has to be holding each other accountable to the actions and the creed. Is there another standard? Yes, there's a different standard that has to be exercised by those who say they are executing the laws and the policies that have been implemented by gubernatorial decisions and votes and those things in elections. These individuals have to be the ones who not only execute the policies, but they have to model the policies. And so they have to model that with and without the uniform on. Now, is that unfair or is that extra pressure? It is, but that's the career. That's what you chose to do. That's what you chose to represent. And so we just have to be honest in that conversation. And I think on the other side, we have to be honest as community members that, hey, listen, when we get in trouble, when there's a robbery, when there's something that affects us personally, we're going to call these same individuals that we're going to disrespect in other forms. And so we've got to bring an arrest to that. We can't walk around with this sensation of making them the enemy, but then the moment I need them to advocate on my behalf. And so we've got to make sure that that line of communication is open. But when we talk about police misconduct, there has to be accountability and there have to be level of consequences. And I believe that we're talking about possibly making sure there's a network in counties and in states where if you have misconduct with one department, you can't leave that department and go become an officer in another department, and your behavior was never checked, it was never brought to anyone's attention, and there was no behavior modification and proof of that over a length of time. So I think those are important. One of the second pillar that we talked about was policy and oversight. And so again, we've got to see policy change from the inside. We talked about policy, we talked about practices, and those things that are going to be important for us. Proper identification of an officer themselves, making sure that individuals know who they are, and there is a easily understood or comprehensive understanding of why a person has been stopped, pulled over, questioned, brought to the side, and that those conversations are very clear and concise. There has to be demographic transparency. We need to understand that there needs to be proper representation of areas. It can't be overly populated and look one way, but all of law enforcement looks another way. We've got to figure out a way to bring some balance to that, or we're going to continue to see this disparity of or this consistency of not getting along and relationships not being able to be built. And then, as we talked about earlier, police brutality, when we talked about the policy and oversight, we talked about use of force and making sure that there's data on use of force, and that there's special training after a use of force incident, and that policies and information are made public so that we understand what that use of force limitation is and how far it goes. Around the country now, we're beginning to see the chokehold being banned. We're beginning to see the no-knock warrant. There's an issue with that. I mean, because these things took lives. These things caused permanent situations, things that can't be fixed. We can't go back and make things better from those things. But we do need to figure out, how do we go forward in a more synergized and serene situation for both officers and citizens. Thirdly, we talked about community policing and crime reduction and how that happens. And I know in most cases, we're talking about individuals being comfortable to, if they see something, say something. I happen to, on the boots on the ground level, I happen to work in polarized situations where on one hand, there's a heavy involvement with law enforcement through the Community Safety and Engagement Action Plan and the One Cop program that we instituted at our faith institution here at the Potter's House. And on the other hand, as the executive director of Cure Violence, it's a non-law enforcement engagement approach to reducing violence, not necessarily crime, but violence and the killings that are happening, and particularly through gun violence. And so just trying to balance that is very difficult. But on one hand, we understand that as a citizen, you have a right to report crime or to report something that's going to tear down the fiber of the neighborhood and having a safe and enjoyable environment. So we understand that. On the other hand, our public health approach is credible messengers who are sent back in the community from which they've come, for which they have credibility. They go back into this community as a vaccine and begin to speak to those high-risk individuals who are most likely to carry a weapon, use a weapon, or be the victim of gun violence. And we try to make sure that we give them as many tools and model for them and expose them to something different. We believe, just like in a pandemic, it's because of exposure. So one of the first things that we want to do is to detect and interrupt the transmission of violence. We want to then begin to make sure that there's a change of norm, that it's not normal for there to be violence. And so but if we're seeing this from a police brutality standpoint, it's very difficult for us to perpetuate a different messages. So again, that accountability becomes really different. And then we've just got to stop the spread. That's just pretty the bottom line. We've got to make sure that retaliation and those things don't take place. So there's a plethora of issues, right? So there has to be a plethora of approaches and methods of us getting to this place of crime reduction, violence reduction, and making sure that we've got safe communities out there. And I think that's really the bottom line. And then ultimately, the action plan talks about training and education. And so when we talk about early and intentional recruitment, then we're also talking about being trained and understanding that we have to be re-educated And I think when we talked earlier about some of the statistics that Sasha gave us, there needs to be a platform to talk about these statistics. There needs to be context so that we understand what these statistics are saying, so that our approaches are appropriate and that we can make the differences that we need to make. So, you know, involving the youth, talking about alternative methods other than just immediate arrest, looking at areas like de-escalation, those are very important. And just making sure, again, we go back to the cultural competency and being culturally responsible, and making sure we have proper interaction with individuals, looking at how we handle microaggression, looking at how we handle diversity and inclusion. And I think the bottom line for many of us is just looking at the value that we give to another human being. And when we start talking about the value of a human being from a law enforcement standpoint and or from a community standpoint, it's more difficult, just like Dr. Nelson said, close up, it's more difficult to bring harm to someone close up. Oh, I think we got some live music there. So it's hard to hurt someone close up, and it's hard to have that type of interaction, negative interaction, when you get to know someone or know their family and begin to see the impact that crime and violence is having, not only on you immediately, but what's surrounding us economically. When we start talking about education, we have to talk about the economics that are being impacted in these particular situations. So not sure if we answered any or all of the questions that were suggested, but trying to make some specific notation or verbalize specifically some of the things that Dr. Nelson gave us a phenomenal general view of what it means to come in and survey and get perspective of both civilian community and law enforcement, to begin to bridge that gap, because it has to be bridged. Because for me, it's not law enforcement versus community, it's civilian versus it's civilian and law enforcement in community. And so I love what Dr. Nelson says. It's like, we're not doing it to the community, or we're not doing it to the neighborhoods when we're policing. The policing should be done with. And I heard someone frame it as Neoplatonic. It's not either or, it's both and. And so we need to make sure that we're inclusive in how we're moving forward to deal with crime, to deal with policing, to deal with safe community, and to bridge those gaps that definitely have seams in them, where we see too many things falling through the cracks and too many senseless killings, and things are going, and I'm not going to say unsolved, but unresolved in too many situations.
All right, thank you so much, Bishop McGuire. It was very enlightening. And for the sake of time, I would like to introduce our final speaker. So we have Dr. Tammy Hodo. She is the founder and president of All Things Diverse LLC, an educational consulting company that provides services to businesses, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations and government entities that value diversity and want to develop a high inclusive workforce. Dr. Hodo earned her bachelor's from Albany State University, her Master of Public Administration from Columbus State University, and her PhD from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in Urban Studies, with a minor in sociology specializing in race, class, gender, and ethnicity. She worked in academia for over 18 years in many positions, including faculty and university administrator. She continues to be active in academia as she writes academic articles relevant to the experiences of minorities in America. Her most recent publications in 2021 include 2 chapters in African American Families, Research, Theory, and Practice, published by Cognella Academic Publishing. In those 2 chapters, she wrote about the urban experiences of African American families and the theoretical and methodological issues of studying the African American family. Currently, she's writing a book with a colleague titled Having Hard Conversations on Race, Ethnicity, Politics, and Social Justice in the Workplace and Educational Settings, which is set to be published this year in 2022. Her company, All Things Diverse, has contracts with the City of Jacksonville addressing policing and trust with minority communities. Recently, the City of Tampa is training employees on diversity and prison bias, as well as the federal government Division of Veterans Administration, wherein we teach employees the cultural competency, microaggressions, and communication styles. Dr. Hoda has written the course content for an educational vendor on the implicit bias and microaggressions. Recently, she wrote course content for the discrimination awareness in the workplace. Also, as a TED Talk speaker, she discussed the social implication of race. Dr. Hodo is also a service-connected disabled veteran of the U.S. Navy. Hi, Dr. Hodo. How are you doing this evening?
I'm good, Daniela. Thank you for all the great introduction. So I just want to briefly just hit on a couple things. So I agree with everything Dr. Nelson and Bishop McGuire said in regards to what community policing should be, as it is something that's active. One of the contracts that All Things Diverse had was with the city of Jacksonville, and it was a Safer Together initiative, where we held 7 meetings with community members and different people in positions within JSO and city council members after the murder of George Floyd to kind of gauge what the climate was in Jacksonville in regards to how they view policing. It was at times pretty contentious. We talked quite a bit about systemic racism, and that's understanding that historical power differentiation between groups of people and recognizing the slave patrols, and that, initially African Americans were not considered human beings and were not counted as such. And just acknowledging the difference or the disparities that we see in various communities. And so we know that race is not biologically real, it's a social construct. The beautiful complexion of those with melanin skin has to deal with their ancestry. Those born closer to the equator have darker skin. It protects us from the sun's UV rays, but it has real world implications. I agree with Dr. Nelson when he talked about, like, when we saw what happened to George Floyd. I would say the minority community was not very surprised. It's something that we have talked about in the past, but I think it was kind of the perfect storm in the midst of the pandemic, because everybody was standing still. And so other people got to see what was recorded, which many people in the Black and Brown community discuss. Now, when I talk about race not being biologically real, again, we're all human beings, but again, it does have serious implications, as we see. And we should talk about the discretion at all levels of policing or all levels of the criminal justice system. So in regards to the police, they're the first, line of that discretion. So they get to decide if they're going to arrest someone, if they're going to give them a citation, if they're going to give them a warning. Then we see the prosecutor, and they get to decide, if they're going to prosecute a person based on the police recommendation, and then the judge. And we continue to see disparities. We look at studies that show there are disparities at every level of that, in regards to who's being stopped. In Jacksonville, when we did the report, we talked about Orange Crush Weekend, and that was labeled as Black Beach Weekend. So JSO decided to move 200 inmates out of the jail, and they moved them to different counties in preparation for Orange Crush Weekend. But we have the Florida-Georgia game, which is the largest outside cocktail party in the US, and that doesn't take place. So just having conversations about those differences and why they thought that was necessary, recognizing that we're all human, that we do have biases, but understanding that, there's something called the index of dissimilarity. Jacksonville is still very much a segregated community based on that social construct of race and that lack of engagement between community. I believe community policing is important. People should be walking beats. They should have relationships with people in the community. I agree that we need to get rid of this whole ideal of no snitching, because that is so problematic in our community. We don't want to share insight, or when something happens, as Dr. Nelson said, unless it's one of our relatives, we don't want to have a conversation about it. But I also think that police need to understand when they come into communities that are hyper segregated, that lack trust, that they need to maybe meet the person somewhere else when they're willing to have these conversations. Don't come to my door in a uniform, because that may have lingering effects after you leave my community. I think that people, should look at reading things such as like the new Jim Crow, recognizing systemic racism is very much built into the American system, in the education system, and the healthcare system, and the criminal justice system. It is part of the fabric of American society. I think we also, as the bishop talked about, must talk about economics when we talk about crime. If I'm working and I have a career path and I have something that is going to sustain my family financially, the probability of me engaging in a, a different type of economy, right? The informal economy is going to decrease. So I think that it's really relevant that we have these conversations. And I think faith leaders are a major component of that conversation. Studies continuously show that Black and Brown communities go to church more often, have more, believe in religion and are actively engaged in the church. And so it's nice to see Bishop McGuire and others engaged and ready to take part in this, because they are a major, a key player in minority communities, because they're someone that we can trust and they can bridge that gap between the relationship with police and minority communities as they kind of stand in the fold and make those introductions and lend their social capital to police officers that they've developed relationships with, that they trust, and introduce them to community members. So I know we're at 7:01, so I'm not going to go on. I just wanted to add my little part. I enjoy the conversation, thankful to be part of it, but again, don't want to hold us up. So.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ho. I really enjoyed your piece. I was wondering if anyone just had a question they wanted to ask before we end the meeting, or if they wanted to voice any insight that they had, an opinion. We can open the floor right now.
I had a question. I'd like to ask speakers and leave it to whichever one wants to respond, maybe all three, but in their mind, what is the most critical thing we need to do right now to improve the situation of public safety in Jacksonville?
I don't mind going first. I'll tell you what I believe, some of the things, and we recommended in the Safer Together. We need to talk about implicit bias. We need to talk about, people, the way the police engage with the community, but also the way the community engages with the police. We have particular biases that we impose upon other people that we tend not to engage with often. And I think that we need to have some type of training in that regard. I think that we are tasking the police with too much. They're responding to mental health calls and all these other calls that they're not really equipped to address. I think we also need to talk about thin blue line, where people don't want to, talk about when they have a colleague that they know is using excessive force. I think that we need to also look at, how the community can be actively engaged in reviewing some of the cases that are questionable. I find sometimes that we're not getting the video camera footage from the police officers as quickly as we could potentially be. And so we recommended, training on implicit bias. We recommended something similar to a citizen review board. We also recommended, having mental health professionals ride with police officers when they respond to calls that require that, because again, they're just like, to me, educators. They're being tasked with doing so much that they don't necessarily have all the skill set to be able to do that, or the training they've gotten just touches on bits and pieces, but it's not extensive. And we also need to talk about the economic situation, and transportation in Jacksonville. How am I going to get to these jobs? Are there manufacturing jobs? Let's talk about skill sets and the trades, and how do we go about doing that and getting people actively engaged in the formal economy so that maybe we can have that crime reduction.
Thank you very much, Tammy.
I agree. I think that if you were to put on a board why people call the police, the things that impact it, from poverty, from family issues to educational system, you'll have a whole list, and nothing on that list does law enforcement have control over. So, and it's kind of daunting that all of these things is why we call the police, but very few of those things, if any, law enforcement actually has any power or control over. So I think it's a lot beyond, when you say beyond policing, there's a lot beyond, but that's the object that we see in front of us. That's the power and authority to take life and liberty. But it's so many other things that impact before it gets there. And that's, you know, vestiges of slavery, institution, all of those things impact. So I say we just get in it, students, young folk, old folk, rich, you get in wherever you can and work. That's where I am. Let's get in and work. It's one thing to talk about it, but get in and work, whether it's on the faith community, whether it's educational institution, whether you're a 20-year-old trying to figure out where and how you want to get in and work. It's about the work.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add is that when you talk about the social determinants of health and all the things that just wrap around individuals who seem to be the larger proponents of crime and violence, either from a victim standpoint or the assailant standpoint, we're really looking at the inequity of opportunity. And where there's a lack of opportunity, then we don't see transformation, we don't see growth, we don't see economic improvement. Just this opportunity has to come. And so, and Dr. Nelson's right. A lot of times we focus on policing and some of those things that are pretty obvious because that's what hits the news. But at some kind of way, we've got to create as a community greater opportunity, both educationally and vocationally for individuals and formerly incarcerated individuals. When we talk about the economic disparities, you're talking about so many people that cannot get a job because they've been incarcerated, and that is lending to our economic situation and the disparities now. Because at some point, I've got to do something to eat, and so I go back to a familiar behavior. I go back to those things that I was exposed to if I'm not giving a fresh and new opportunity. So when we talk about dollars and dollars spent and opportunities financially from seizures and all of those things, we need to look at putting that money back into the community to prepare for those individuals who need another chance, whatever that is. And not everyone is educationally astute either. So everyone's not going to have that opportunity to go to a university or a college to further their education, but they're ready to work. But we've got to make sure that we don't get so technologically advanced that we oust all the jobs for individuals who could become viable citizens. So, but once again, thank you, Daniela and Sasha, and of course, Dr. Stone, just for allowing us to be on this forum today. It's been a blessing.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank Daniela and Sasha and all the other interns that support these programs, and particularly want to thank our speakers. Really gave a lot of insight. We know that you're in doing the work, and we appreciate what you're doing, and we want you to continue. And we want to express our gratitude for what you're doing, because it is so necessary right now. And you're willing to get in and do the work despite all the confusion and the talk that goes on. You know, getting in and doing the work, as you said, Bishop, is the most important thing. So thank you very much. On behalf of the Urban League and the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice, again, thank all of you, and you have a great evening, and we look forward to further discussions on our campaign to stop the violence and make peace.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah,
Bye,
have a good night,
everyone.
everyone.
Good night.